Hello folks, so welcome to our lesson on Chapter 10, which is entitled At the Crossroads of Business and Art. So much of what we've been focusing on through the semester is the idea of cinema as an art form, as a form of communication, as a form of, as a medium by which ideas are expressed and messages are portrayed to an audience through the various elements of film meaning that we've talked about. What we're going to talk about today is basically the idea that although film is an art form, film is a capital-intensive art form, meaning that it costs a lot of money to make films, and if people want to keep making films, then their films are going to have to somehow offer a return on the investment. So just to have a look at the current state of the Hollywood major studios, firstly, what used to be two major studios have combined into one major studio. So what were formerly TriStar and Columbia Pictures have now merged into one studio. Columbia Pictures, TriStar, Sony Pictures Entertainment, to demonstrate the fact that they're owned by Sony in Japan. Disney, whose films are distributed by their own distribution company called Buena Vista, is owned by the Walt Disney Company. Paramount is owned by a company named Viacom. 20th Century Fox is owned by the News Corporation, which is run out of Australia. Warner Brothers is owned by Time Warner, and Universal is owned by General Electric. So, in the classical Hollywood period, the period up until between the mid-1950s and the early 1960s, most of the major studios were owned by moguls who themselves owned the production company and who themselves were solely in the entertainment business and the film business. So people like Harry Kahn at Columbia, Louis Mayer at MGM, Daryl Zanuck at Fox had in fact founded and developed the film production company and had spent their lives exclusively in the film business. The current situation is that now most of the major film studios are owned by communications conglomerates or other corporate entities who have additional interests in addition to filmmaking. Now, the other thing that's been going on is that the box office has actually been steadily falling since the 1950s. Ever since the introduction of television, the market share that movies have in terms of their total proportion of the home entertainment market has been steadily declining. And this has been going on really quite steadily since the 1950s. Ever since the introduction of television, television grabbed a huge proportion of the marketplace for popular entertainment from film. Then when video arcades appeared in the late 1970s, early 1980s, video arcades grabbed another chunk of that total market share. When home video games became popular, the home video games and home video games grabbed another chunk of that marketplace. Then when home computers became popular, another chunk of that marketplace was grabbed, then streaming, and so on and so forth. So the market has been gradually shrinking, and box office revenue in the United States falls off almost immediately. So filmmakers are now, and I should say film production companies are now, very, very concerned about the opening weekend for a film, because basically the opening weekend for a film is when they make all of their money. So when Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith in 2005 was released, it was the most anticipated movie of that year. It was the episode of the Star Wars series that people had been literally waiting years for, because it was the one that was going to explain how young Anakin Skywalker went over to the dark side of the Force and became Darth Vader. It had a strong opening weekend and basically died off a couple of weeks later. Other films dominated it at the box office. And box office revenue has been sagging for years. From 2002 to 2004, box office revenues remained flat at $9.5 billion. So no increase at all in those 3 years. The revenues simply remained at the same level. Halfway through 2005, the year that Revenge of the Sith was released, the studios took the biggest hit that they'd ever taken in their earnings since 1982. And 1982, I think I've mentioned earlier in the course, that was an utterly disastrous year for the major studios. What the major studios decided they were going to do was that they were going to saturate the film marketplace with more big tentpole releases than any other summer had been in history. So in the summer of 1982, there were, where previously there would have been a dozen or 2 dozen major releases released in the summer, there were about 100 released that summer. And some of the biggest titles of all time came out that summer. Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, successful film. E.T., hugely successful. Poltergeist, hugely successful. And those were, I'm exaggerating a bit here, but those were around the only 3 to 5 movies that made money. Just about everything else released in the summer of '82 tanked horribly, including 2 films that are now considered to be among the greatest films ever made in their genre. John Carpenter's The Thing, considered to be one of the greatest horror movies ever made, tanked at the box office in 1982. Ridley Scott's film Blade Runner, not just considered to be one of the greatest science fiction movies ever made, but one of the greatest movies ever made, tanked at the box office in 1982. So imagine 2005 was even worse than that, and by 2008, revenues had completely flatlined at $8.8 billion, meaning that they were $0.7 billion down from 2004. Again, now the box office has to compete with video games, online gaming, and home viewing. Now, you're probably thinking, well, I'm finding it awfully hard to feel sorry for these people who are snagging in $8.8 billion. That's an awful lot of money. But the thing that needs to be understood is how that money is, when it comes in at the box office, is actually divided up. So the first thing that the money that is earned at the box office has to do is it has to cover the costs of the movie. So firstly, we talk about the gross costs of a movie, that is, all the possible costs that go into the movie, versus what are called the rental costs of the movie, the costs incurred by the theaters themselves. So the first term that's used to describe what a movie actually costs is what's called the negative cost of a film. So the negative cost of a film is all of the costs that are incurred by the actual production of the film. The reason it's called the negative cost is that the production of a film was considered to be complete once a master negative of the film had been prepared so that positive prints of the film could be struck and then distributed. Nowadays, we do things digitally, so a master negative is arrived at electronically, but basically what this refers to is everything up to the step in the production of the film where copies of the film are now ready to be run off and sent to theaters. This includes all of the salaries for the talent, so actors, directors, production designers, all of those people have to be paid for. This has to pay the technical crew, the cost of the set design. It has to pay the actual cost of the lab, of processing the film, of editing, of sound design. Everything that goes into the final agreed upon version of the film is part of the negative cost. The negative cost, again, is only part of the gross cost of the film. Another part of the gross cost of the film is publicity and promotion. How much it's going to cost to actually advertise and promote this movie. Finally, a third item that goes into the gross cost of the film is the points. This will be the percentage of the box office gross of a movie that are taken by top directors, stars, and investors, and a percentage of DVD revenue taken after the theatrical release of the film, again taken by top directors, stars, and investors. So, if you're not a well-known actor or a character actor, and you're just establishing your career, you will likely be paid a salary to appear in the film, which you will have agreed upon. If you're a big star or a top director, however, you might insist on receiving an actual percentage of the box office gross for the film. Also, the investors in the film, the people who put up the money for the film to be made in the first place, will also be expecting a return on their investment. And there's an interesting story that goes along with that. When the first Star Wars film was released, George Lucas actually had a fairly low budget to work with, and most of the money he had to work with needed to go to the film's special effects. So he couldn't actually afford to pay the actors the normal salaries that the actors' union would have demanded that they received for the film. So as a compromise, he paid them a reduced salary and negotiated a tiny, tiny, tiny proportion of the profits of the film to go to each of the main actors in the film instead. And it was really tiny. It was something like, 0.25% for Harrison Ford and 0.5% for Mark Hamill and 1/3% for Carrie Fisher. I forget the exact numbers, but they were very, very, very low. The film has this massive, huge opening, gets released to other theaters, still plays to massive sellout audiences at those theaters, and nobody expected Star Wars to be a hit. Everybody expected it was going to be a huge flop. Literally within 2 weeks of the film's release, all three of them are independently wealthy because they've made so much money just off this tiny little proportion of the gross. So, the gross revenue, the gross cost of the film includes all of those costs. So, the revenue for the movie, the amount of money that comes back through the box office, is distributed in these ways. 15% goes to the actual investors in the production, the people that put up the money so that the film could be made. 20% of that money goes to rental return to the distribution system. 20% of that money goes to advertising and publicity for the film. 25% of that money goes to the distribution company. 10% goes to the actual theater itself in the form of the theater's profit. 10% goes to the actual theater itself in the form of covering the theater's expenses. So really, by the time that box office dollar gets back to the studio is actually only getting back 15 cents of every dollar the movie that takes in. And that basically means that in order for the studio to make money, or not to make money, but just to break roughly even, the movie's got to make somewhere between 5 and 6 times what it cost the studio to make it. So, all of that money that comes in is split between the profit participants, what it costs to distribute the movie, and the exhibitors. So in order for the studio to see money back, the movie needs to make about 6 times, between 5 and 6 times, what it costs to make it, just to make its money back, not to be profitable. Now, the average production cost of a movie in 2007 is $71 million plus $36 million for advertising. So the average cost of a movie 12 years ago is, factoring both of those, is $107 million. So a movie needs to make 6 times 107 million, $642 million at the box office, more than $500 million at the box office, just to break even before the studio actually sees any profit. You're probably going to ask me, well, why are your numbers 12 years old? Because after 2007, coincidentally the year Spider-Man 3 was released, the Motion Picture Association of America actually stopped releasing this data on costs. So one thing we can assume that my numbers, being 12 years old, are probably very conservative. Films now probably have to make upwards of $1 billion at the box office just to break even, only to cover their costs, not to actually make any money. So that's from the mainstream. That is out of what we call the mainstream production system. Now, as we talked about in our lecture on film history, what we've actually had really since about the mid-1980s, what has been developing more and more since the mid-1980s, is that when we talk about mainstream American cinema, we have been really for about 30 years or more, going on 35 years or more, really talking about two mainstream American cinemas. The first one is the big budget mainstream American cinema, which gives us the tentpole movies like Avengers Endgame and Spider-Man Far From Home, or Spider-Man 3, or Revenge of the Sith. The second one is the so-called independent American cinema, which gives us the movies like Michael Moore's documentary films. It gives us movies like Clint Eastwood's latest films. He makes them through his own production company called Mel Paso, and they're usually released through bigger studios. Gives us movies like Jordan Peele's films, Us and Get Out. And you're probably saying to me, well, hang on a minute. Those hardly seem to me to be independent films, because classically, when we think of independent movies, what we actually, and this definition comes back from independent movies prior to the 1970s and 80s. When we think of independent movies, we think of low-budget kind of grindhouse movies that are made on an actual shoestring budget, cost very little to make, and they're often horror films or exploitation films of some point. So we're thinking about things like Night of the Living Dead, The Hills Have Eyes, Last House on the Left. They're low-budget movies, usually really low production values, and they tend to be really nasty. Well, from the mid-80s on, when we're talking about independent movies, we're really just talking about where the money to make the movie comes from. Does the money actually come from this mainstream Hollywood tentpole system that gives us things like Avengers Endgame or Spider-Man Far From Home? Or does it come from other areas that give us other movies? So there's an interesting story about, I think, close to 15 years ago now. A filmmaker, Zach Braff, made a movie called Garden State, and he made it as an independent film. He was originally making the movie in conjunction with a well-established, fairly mainstream production company, and an investor was interested in contributing to the movie. And the investor said, "Can you tell me what the cost breakdown on this movie is going to be?" So Zach Braff, the director of the movie, gives him a cost breakdown of the movie, and the investor says, "Well, there's no way I could afford enough money to make sure this movie is ever made." So Zach Braff actually hadn't signed a contract with the studio yet, and said, "Well, hold on. Why don't I write up another budget, assuming that we're financing this as an independent film?" So Zach Braff gives the guy another budget, and the guy says, "I can afford that. Let's produce the movie ourselves." So independent films, you're probably already guessing, just from the fact that the guy couldn't afford to contribute to the budget that a mainstream studio would want, but could afford to finance the whole movie on the budget of an independent level. Independent films tend to work at much, much lower budgets than mainstream movies. So the budgets are much, much lower, and for that reason, the returns on the budgets, because they don't have access to the mainstream tentpole distribution system, tend to be much, much lower as well. So independent film used to mean incredibly low budget, but it has come to mean things that are financed outside the Hollywood system. And one of the examples I think I gave you, I think I may have mentioned throughout the course, was Kenneth Branagh's movie of Hamlet, released in 1995. It was filmed in a 70mm widescreen format. It had huge stars left, right, and center. Charlton Heston, Gerard Depardieu, John Gielgud was giving one of his final performances. Robin Williams was in there. Billy Crystal was in there, really badly miscast as the first Gravedigger. Jack Lemmon was in there. Huge, big stars were in there. The movie was shot in 70mm format. It cost a ton of money to make. Julie Christie played Hamlet's mother, and it was considered an independent movie. All that independent really means anymore is that the money doesn't come out of the normal Hollywood mainstream. Now, independent films, rather than being distributed through the tentpole system, tend to be distributed through film festivals. So the film will be shown at a film festival like TIFF, or the Cannes Film Festival, or the Vienna Film Festival, and it will pick up, people will see the film, be impressed by it, and will agree to distribute the movie. Now, Harvey Weinstein has become somewhat notorious over the past couple of years. Prior to his notoriety for having assaulted many people, he was the founder of an independent film company called Miramax. They got their breakthrough again in the late 1980s with a movie made by Steve Soderbergh, who was then an up-and-coming director. He's now considered to be a mainstream director. That movie was called Sex, Lies, and Videotape. That film was very highly critically received, and for that reason, Miramax got established as an independent film producer of quality films. Miramax was bought out by Disney in 1993, and the Weinsteins were actually left Miramax in 2005. So Miramax is technically an independent film company. They're outside of the big tentpole system. However, they are owned by a major studio. So even though they're making their movies and financing them according to the structure of an independent studio, they are still to a great degree controlled by a mainstream studio. All of Quentin Tarantino's movies have been made at Miramax. Also made at Miramax, Neil Jordan's film The Crying Game, Todd Field's film In the Bedroom, wonderful movie with Ben Kingsley and Jennifer Connelly called House and Sand and Fog, and Roberto Rodriguez's film Sin City. When independent studios put a film together, they usually release the film at a festival, so there is a very, very strong competition to have your film given a slot, a screening at a film festival. And the reason for screening your movie at a film festival is to attract a distributor, to find a company that will be interested in distributing your movie. When Michael Moore's film, Fahrenheit 9/11, which was released in 2004, was released, or prior to its release, I should say, they had a little bit of a problem. The movie had been financed by a well-established mainstream distribution company, but the chief executives at the distribution company realized that the message of the film was going to be very, very anti-George Bush, and that the movie was going to be encouraging people to vote against George W. Bush in the upcoming 2004 election. For that reason, the distributor backed out of the movie and basically told Michael Moore, "We're not going to distribute your movie anymore." So Michael Moore presents the film at the Cannes Film Festival, and another distributor actually comes in, saves the day, and distributes the movie. So that's one of the prime reasons why independent filmmakers are interested in going to film festivals. And the public becomes very interested in going to film festivals as well, because at film festivals you often see a lot of movies that don't get a very, very big release, a lot of films that are outside of the mainstream. I saw a wonderful Canadian movie at a film festival a couple of years ago called The Grand Seduction. No, the title is not quite what you might think, but it's a very, 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 very funny movie made by a very interesting Canadian actor-director named Don McKellar. This movie never actually got a theatrical release. It played the festival circuit and was very unlike a mainstream movie. Major film festivals include the Sundance Film Festivals, founded by Robert Redford in 1986, and Sundance deliberately is a forum for films outside of the mainstream. As a matter of fact, if you're making a mainstream movie, you would probably not be able to get it screened at Sundance. TIFF, the Toronto International Film Festival, has been around, going on certainly 45 years, perhaps longer. I remember that the first TIFF, it was called at that point the Festival of Festivals, happened when I was around 13 or 14, so at least 10 years old. And then there's the Telluride Film Festival as well. Major independent filmmakers, people like Quentin Tarantino, Joel and Ethan Coen, made, among other movies, No Country for Old Men. John Sayles, actually wonderful filmmaker. If you ever get a chance, two of his films I highly recommend. One of those films is called Lone Star. Actually, absolutely wonderful movie. He's very, very much an alternative filmmaker to mainstream filmmakers. Made a wonderful movie in the early 80s called, he's made several wonderful movies. One wonderful movie called Baby It's You. Another very interesting movie made in the mid-80s called The Brother from Another Planet. Now, what tends to happen often with directors is that they will get their start working as independent directors, and for that reason they tend to do their best work or their most creative work very, very early on in their career. For instance, Christopher Nolan did a very, very interesting movie early on in his career called Memento, and it was a movie that, like French New Wave films we've looked at, played around with perceptions of time and memory, and whether or not the past can adequately be remembered. Once he gets into the mainstream, he starts getting movies like Batman Begins, The Dark Knight, and The Dark Knight Rises. So, the more that a director moves over to the majors, the less often creative the director becomes. The director loses creative control over their work, even though they get access to much, much more in the way of resources. Steve Soderbergh, again, is another example. I told you about Sex, Lies, and Videotape. Very, very innovative movie he made on a very, very low budget in '89. He has also become a major studio director. He made an Oscar-winning film named Traffic. Made a very, very good thriller a couple of years ago called, I am struggling to remember the name of it, Side Effects, made with Jude Law and Catherine Zeta-Jones. But you can really, really see the difference in the second half of his career from the first half of his career. He also made all of the Ocean's 11, Ocean's 12, Ocean's 13. Those were Steve Soderbergh films as well. And you can really see the difference. The movies are much, much, much more polished, but they're nowhere near as innovative as they used to be. Now, a couple of years ago, Christopher Nolan did release a film called Dunkirk. I should know that off the top of my head. And Nolan appears to be reaching that degree of reputation that he has as a director, where he can pretty much do what he wants, and he's no longer confined just to making mainstream movies. So Dunkirk does do some very interesting things with perceptions of time, so it sort of recollects his earlier self. But a director has to actually become very, very well known and very, very powerful, someone like Stanley Kubrick or somebody like Steven Spielberg, in order to simply do the films that they want to make in the style that they want to make them. Now, films are not just made for the theater anymore. They're made for home video, either on DVD or formerly on VHS. They're also made for pay cable or pay-per-view. They're also made for streaming. They're also made for broadcast television. So these are markets where the film can make some of its money back, even if it doesn't do well at the box office. And a very famous example of this is a movie called The Shawshank Redemption. The movie was released in 1994, tanked at the box office. However, the movie got very, very, very strong reviews. The reviews were so strong for the movie that it was re-released, and again it tanked at the box office. The movie was thought to be a failure until people started renting it on VHS. Word of mouth gets around by VHS, by people seeing the movie on VHS, as to how strong the movie is, that eventually it becomes the most popular movie ever made, according to a poll on IMDb. So everybody starts renting the movie, with the result that the movie that failed at the box office becomes a profitable movie eventually through VHS rentals. Usually, the studios try to get their money back at the theater. Traditionally, prior to streaming, the studios try to get their money back at the theatrical release. If they don't get their money back at the theatrical release, they'll get their money back on pay cable or pay-per-view. So I'm sure everybody has Rogers or Bell Media, and you have a feature where you can see a relatively recent movie for paying $3. That's pay-per-view. The studios get a licensing fee for every movie that's watched on pay-per-view. After people are no longer interested in watching it for pay-per-view, then the movie is put out on home video, and the studio hopes to make some money through the home video release. And finally, a few years later, the movie will be released on broadcast television, and if it has been a particularly popular movie, the TV studio will pay a lot of money to present the movie on broadcast television. In addition to that, studios try to make their money back by product licensing or product tie-ins. Well, what does that mean? Well, basically, Movies often function as a big commercial for other products. If you ever watch a movie with Adam Sandler called Happy Gilmore, it's no coincidence that everybody in the movie wants to go to Subway to have a sandwich every 5 minutes. Well, I'm exaggerating, but Subway is mentioned so many times in the movie. The reason for that is that the Subway people paid the producers of Happy Gilmore a ton of money to make sure that that Subway was mentioned in the movie. So let's now talk specifically, though, about product licensing and product tie-ins. Remember what I talked about a few minutes ago about how the studios were initially owned by people in the business of filmmaking, but now they're owned by people who are corporate conglomerates who have tie-ins to other types of markets as well. Time Warner, for example. Time Warner is not only in the business of filmmaking, they're in the business of magazines, they're in the business of publishing. They basically create all of their media programming and control all of the distribution. So any revenue from their products, they get to keep. They don't have to pay off a distributor themselves. They are the distributors. So these product tie-ins I talked about a couple of minutes ago, again, in order to get all of those Subway sandwiches into Happy Gilmore, Subway actually paid a license fee to make sure that all of those submarine sandwiches are in Happy Gilmore. In addition to that, you also have product tie-ins. So when a movie named Who Framed Roger Rabbit was released in 1988, there were huge marketing tie-ins between the producers of the movie. Again, it was made by Roger Rabbit was actually made by the same person who made Death Becomes Her. The director was Robert Zemeckis. There were $12 million worth of McDonald's ads and $10 million worth of Coca-Cola ads. The McDonald's ads and the Coca-Cola ads featured animated characters from the Roger Rabbit movie itself, and by McDonald's and Coca-Cola paying for the use of animated characters from the film. Firstly, that money from McDonald's and Coca-Cola helps to cover the cost of the film. Secondly, the filmmakers get free advertising because they have Roger Rabbit characters on McDonald's bags and Coca-Cola cans. In 2001, product licensing brought in $70 billion. In 1990, so almost 30 years ago, in films released, in a film named Total Recall, you have 55 references in the movie to 28 brand name products. In the film Ghost that same year, you have 23 references to 16 brand name products. And in the film Pretty Woman, also from that same year, 20 references to 18 brand name products. Product placement is when they actually stick the product itself in the movie. So a marketing tie-in is when another company is using the movie itself to help promote its own product. So again, an example of a marketing tie-in is a few years ago, the movie The Hobbit, An Unexpected Journey was released, and my son asked me please to take him to Denny's for breakfast so we could get the Bilbo Baggins Hobbit breakfast at Denny's. So I paid $60 for a breakfast I otherwise would have paid $25 for, because it was now the Bilbo Baggins breakfast and served in a cup and paper plates which had Hobbit images on it. Yes, I paid $35 for adjectives. So Denny's not only would have paid the makers of the film a fee to use the name Bilbo Baggins to promote their breakfast, but they're also helping to advertise the movie by using content from the movie. A product placement is when the product is literally stuck right in the movie, like the example I gave you from Adam Sandler's film Happy Gilmore, in which there are actually Subway sandwiches throughout the whole movie, and at one point in the movie, the main character actually stars in a Subway commercial. They actually managed to fit a Subway commercial right into the middle of the movie as part of the plot. And believe it or not, there are ad agencies that actually specialize in negotiating deals with studios for product placements. Basically, the result of this, the movie you're watching for entertainment, is in many ways a giant commercial. Now, the way the film industry looks like today is that the major studios, as I've mentioned before, are subsidiaries of large communications enterprises. And now the purpose of movies is to actually feed the ancillary market. So this is a crucial point. The movies are now loss leaders. In many cases, movies are expected to lose money. However, the movie will promote the other markets, and it is expected that the money will be made back through the other markets. So just like The Shawshank Redemption failed in the theaters but made a ton of money back through home video rentals, this is the model that especially the mainstream tentpole industry follows today. The movie is not expected to make much money in the theaters because production costs are high and profit margins are low, but because the film company is actually part of a larger communications group, the release of the film provides advertising for the other markets that the same company serves, and those markets are what allows the movie to make its film back. So, for example, the film itself may fail at the box office. However, the video game that is based on the film will make a huge profit at home. Now, what we're seeing increasingly also is, as I've talked about before, Hollywood cinema has always been strongly influenced by foreign cinema because when bad things happen in the world and people need to leave certain parts of the world, if they're working in the film industry, there's really only one place for them to go, and that's Hollywood. So what we've been seeing more and more often is, because foreign filmmakers emigrate to the American industry, elements of foreign styles and styles outside the mainstream of Hollywood tend to get adapted by Hollywood filmmakers. So we saw this with the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, made by a German Expressionist filmmaker. The German Expressionist filmmakers have to leave Germany when Hitler comes to power. Then we look at a film like The Night of the Hunter, made 30 years later, and we can see that there's a strong influence on The Night of the Hunter from German Expressionism. Hollywood also loves movies that are what are called pre-sold properties. So this is why successful Broadway musicals or very successful books like the Harry Potter books are virtually guaranteed to be made into a movie. The studios figured this was already incredibly successful. We barely have to market this. We're almost guaranteed that there'll be a huge audience for it. So it's not surprising that very successful foreign films will be remade in an English language Hollywood version. For instance, a very interesting and very good, sweet and very successful Swedish vampire called Let the Right One In was remade as a Hollywood film starring Chloe Grace Moretz, which was actually pretty good itself, called Let Me In. All right. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our lesson on Chapter 10, and please do let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.